All right. Ever been in a situation where, you're stuck between following the rules and a direct order from someone higher up?
Oh, yeah, I can imagine how tricky that could be.
Well, that's exactly what happened to a court clerk in the Philippines.
Oh,
And,
oh,
yeah, it became a huge Supreme Court case that kind of blew up online.
interesting.
We're going to dive into Espinosa v. Balisnomo.
Okay.
It was decided on February 26, 2020, AM, no, P-20-4039,
Gotcha.
and try to sort out all the twists and turns of this story.
You know what I think is really fascinating about this whole thing is that it gives us a glimpse into how the Philippine judicial system actually works, like behind the scenes.
Right.
It's not just a simple disagreement between a judge and a clerk. It's about this really delicate balance between doing what you're told and interpreting the rules and how much individual judgment is allowed within a big system.
Sounds like a legal thriller.
Yeah, kind of.
So, okay, to set the scene, we've got Judge Espinosa handling a property dispute case.
Okay.
He grants something called a writ of preliminary injunction.
Right.
But I'm guessing a lot of our listeners might not be familiar with that legal term.
Yeah, it can be a little confusing. Think of it like this. Let's say you're trying to stop someone from, I don't know, like cutting down a tree that's protected while a lawsuit is still going on. A writ of preliminary injunction is kind of like hitting the pause button, legally speaking.
I see.
A court order to temporarily stop someone from doing something potentially harmful while the main case is being decided.
So in this specific case, Judge Espinosa issues this injunction and tells his clerk of court, Balisnomo, to basically make it official, issue the writ.
Right.
That's where things get sticky, right?
Exactly. That's the heart of the conflict. Balisnomo refuses to issue the writ, and his argument is based on his understanding of the Clerk of Court manual. He believes he's not actually allowed to do that.
So he's not just being defiant, he's actually making a procedural point.
Precisely. He's saying his role is limited to issuing something called writs of execution. These come at the very end of a case to enforce the final judgment. It's like the action phase.
Okay, so he's drawing a distinction between different types of writs.
Exactly.
So the writ of execution is like, okay, now we're going to seize assets or evict someone
Yeah.
after the court has already made a decision.
Right.
But he's saying his authority doesn't extend to these preliminary injunctions that happen before the final decision.
Exactly, yeah. He didn't think it fell under his job description, essentially.
Wow, this is getting complicated. So we've got a judge who expects his order to be followed and a clerk who's standing his ground because of how he understands the rules.
Yeah, and it gets even more interesting because after all this goes down, a regional trial court steps in,
Right.
and they actually void Judge Espinosa's injunction orders completely.
Wait, so Balisnomo refuses to issue the writ,
Yeah.
and then later on, a higher court says those orders were wrong in the first place.
Yep, that's exactly what happened. Adds a whole other layer to this, right?
It's a real plot twist.
Absolutely. Now the question becomes, was Balisnomo actually right to refuse, since those orders were later considered incorrect? Or was he still in the wrong for disobeying a direct order from a judge? That becomes the big question the Supreme Court had to figure out.
Okay, things are getting really interesting now. We've got conflicting views on the rules, a higher court overturning the initial orders, and the Supreme Court stepping in to settle this whole mess.
You got it. And the Supreme Court's decision in this case is going to have some big implications for how we understand power dynamics within the Philippine judicial system and even the ethical side of following orders versus following your conscience.
This is getting good. But before we jump into all that, let's take a quick look at what the Supreme Court actually decided. All right, so we've got this whole tangled mess. Legal arguments, procedures. What did the Supreme Court decide? Was Balisnomo like a hero for sticking to his principles? Or did he get in trouble for insubordination?
Well, the Supreme Court didn't really see it as heroic. They actually ruled against him, found him guilty of insubordination.
So no points for following his conscience then. I mean, he really did seem to be trying to do what he thought was right, even if it meant disobeying his boss.
Yeah, it is kind of understandable to see it from his point of view.
Right.
But the court really hammered home the idea that there needs to be a clear chain of command in the judiciary.
Yeah.
They said if you let court employees just ignore a judge's order whenever they think it's wrong based on their own interpretation, it could cause chaos and really undermine the whole system.
I get the whole keeping order in the courts thing, but it makes you wonder what options Balisnomo had if he truly believed that judge's order was wrong. Was he just supposed to blindly follow instructions even if he thought they were messed up?
That's a great question, and it's something the Supreme Court actually addressed head on. They said, look, Balisnomo had other ways to raise his concerns, ways that didn't involve flat-out disobedience.
So, like, what could he have done differently instead of refusing?
He could, for example, formally requested clarification from Judge Espinosa, like, hey, here's how I'm reading the rules. Can you give me some guidance?
Right.
If that didn't work, he could have potentially gone to a higher judicial authority, maybe a supervising judge or an administrative body.
So basically, the Supreme Court is saying there's a right way and a wrong way to challenge an order if you don't agree with it. Don't just disobey.
Exactly. The whole system relies on these rules and procedures, and there are ways built in to deal with mistakes or disagreements.
Right.
When you bypass all that and take things into your own hands, even if you have good intentions, it can mess up the whole system.
Okay, it sounds like they're sending a clear message with this ruling, not just to Balisnomo, but to all court employees.
Absolutely. It's a big message.
Like, follow the lawful orders of the judge.
Yep.
If you have concerns, raise them the proper way. Don't go rogue.
Yeah, don't go rogue.
I wonder if this case will be used as a precedent, Like, other courts will refer to it when they have a similar situation with a court employee questioning a judge's order.
It's definitely possible. This ruling could have a big ripple effect, shaping decisions down the line, influencing how they train court personnel to handle this kind of dilemma.
It'll be interesting to see what happens. This whole thing also brings up a bigger question, something that goes beyond just this case. What happens when the law itself seems to conflict with what a person feels is morally right?
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one.
What if the judge's order had been something truly awful, something that went against someone's basic sense of justice?
That's a huge question, a philosophical question that legal scholars and ethicists argue about all the time.
Yeah.
This case doesn't give us a neat answer for that scenario, but it does show that tension that can happen between following the law and following your conscience.
It does feel like an impossible dilemma sometimes.
Yeah.
Where do you draw the line? When is it okay to disobey because you think something's morally wrong? These are tough questions.
Really tough, yeah. And even though this case focuses specifically on the Philippine judicial system, I think these questions are relevant to everyone.
Yeah.
We all face situations where we have to balance our own beliefs with what we're obligated to do, whether it's with authority figures or rules or even entire systems.
It makes you think about obedience, and an individual's role in a bigger structure, the whole mess of navigating a world where rules and morality don't always line up.
Yeah.
It goes way beyond the courtroom.
Absolutely. This case, it's almost like a tiny example of those bigger dilemmas. It makes us look at how much agency we have, the ethical side of things, and how to deal with the demands of a system.
So the Supreme Court gave a clear legal answer in Espinosa v. Balisnomo, but it also kind of opened up a can of worms, all these ethical and philosophical questions that are worth thinking about. Definitely a lot to chew on, even outside of law. This case really highlights the idea that even in a system like the judiciary, which is designed to be impartial, you still can't get away from human judgment, human interpretation.
Yeah, it's true. And that reminds me of that famous quote, I think it's Aristotle, who said, "The law is reason, free from passion."
Right.
But in this case, we see how passion, like Balisnomo's personal conviction, can definitely influence how people within the system actually behave.
It's like a reminder that even with all the rules and procedures we have, we can't escape that human element, all its complexity. Balisnomo was convinced he was doing the right thing, even though the Supreme Court ultimately disagreed.
For sure. It really shows how the law, even though it aims for objectivity, is still interpreted and applied by people who bring their own baggage to the table, their own perspectives and experiences. Not that that makes the law invalid, it's just a layer of nuance to keep in mind.
So for those of us who've been following along with this whole case, what are the big takeaways? What can we learn from this deep dive into Espinosa v. Balisnomo?
I think there are a few really important things to consider. First, the case really underlines how crucial those clear hierarchies and procedures are within the legal system. Those structures are there for a reason. If you want to challenge them or question them, there are established ways to do that.
And second, it highlights that tension, that push and pull between what your conscience is telling you and your duty to follow orders, which I think is something we all deal with, not just in the legal world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes your personal beliefs totally line up with what you're supposed to do, and sometimes they clash big time. And figuring out how to handle those clashes takes careful thought, understanding the rules, maybe even a bit of bravery.
And lastly, I think this case reminds us that even though the law can seem so rigid and structured, it's full of gray areas.
Right.
You look at a single case like Espinosa v. Balisnomo, and it can set off all these ethical and philosophical questions that go way beyond the courtroom.
Yeah, we've gone through a lot today, legal arguments, all those procedures, even touched on some really profound ethical questions. I think what really sticks with me is how even a seemingly straightforward case like this can raise all these really thought-provoking questions about the nature of law, obedience, what it means to make a judgment call.
It just goes to show how powerful the law can be in sparking debates and making us think critically. And you're right, sometimes just one case like this one can be the starting point for much bigger conversations about justice, ethics, and how individual conscience fits into a system.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but as always, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this case? Did the Supreme Court make the right call? What would you have done if you were Balisnomo? Head over to the comments and let us know.
And while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives into fascinating legal cases and all the issues they bring up.
We'll be back next week with another intriguing story from the world of law, ready to break it down and get you thinking. Until then, keep those legal minds sharp and remember, justice is a journey, not just a destination.